Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like gentle mist across ancient moorlands. Tonight, we gather together in this hushed space to slow the racing thoughts that often keep us from peaceful slumber, to allow the mind to wander through shadowed corridors and gaslit streets until consciousness softly releases its grip, and sleep arrives like a welcomed guest. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend these drifting hours here, in the company of mysteries that comfort rather than disturb, puzzles that intrigue without demanding resolution before dreams arrive. Whether you're listening from bustling cities or quiet countryside, from distant shores or familiar lands, know that this moment is yours alone, a sanctuary of story and shadow designed for rest. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling upon London for 3 consecutive days, that particular variety of winter precipitation that seems neither committed to freezing nor to cleansing, but rather settles upon the city like a grey veil drawn across the face of the world. Within our rooms at Baker Street, the atmosphere had grown thick with the accumulated smoke from Holmes's pipe, the steam from countless cups of tea that Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully delivered throughout the long afternoon, and the peculiar tension that always seemed to gather when my friend found himself without a case worthy of his extraordinary faculties. I sat in my familiar leather armchair, positioned at an angle to the hearth where flames danced and whispered against blackened logs, casting amber light across the worn Persian carpet and illuminating the countless volumes that lined our walls in comfortable disorder. Holmes himself occupied the window seat, his lean figure silhouetted against the rain-streaked glass, one hand holding back the heavy curtain, while he gazed down upon the wet street below with an expression of profound melancholy. His dressing gown, that faded purple garment he favoured during extended periods of indoor contemplation, hung loosely about his frame, and his dark hair fell across his forehead in a manner that would have required Mrs. Hudson's gentle remonstration had she observed it. The clock upon the mantelpiece ticked with metronomic precision, marking each second of the quiet evening with a soft, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to underscore rather than disturb the prevailing tranquility. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice barely rising above the sound of rain against glass, "do you ever consider the curious relationship between meteorological conditions and the criminal element? I have observed over the years that certain types of weather seem to suppress certain varieties of transgression, while encouraging others entirely. A fog, for instance, invites the opportunistic thief, but discourages the planned burglary requiring precise timing. Rain such as this tends to keep all but the most desperate or most determined indoors, which creates a most frustrating professional drought for consulting detectives." Before I could formulate a response to this characteristically unusual observation, the sound of rapid footsteps ascending our 17 stairs interrupted the evening's quiet rhythm. Mrs. Hudson's voice, muffled by the intervening door, could be heard in brief conversation with someone whose tone suggested both urgency and refinement. A moment later, our landlady knocked with her customary 3 gentle raps before opening the door to admit our unexpected visitor. The gentleman who entered brought with him a gust of cold air and the scent of rain-soaked wool. He was perhaps 50 years of age, with silver threading through dark hair and a bearing that spoke of military service or similar discipline. His travelling cloak glistened with moisture, and his boots left wet impressions upon our floor, despite his obvious attempts to wipe them upon the landing mat. What struck me most immediately, however, was the expression of profound distress that marked his weathered features. Not the panic of immediate danger, but rather the deeper anxiety of someone who has encountered something that defies rational explanation. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of one accustomed to command. "Forgive my unannounced arrival at this late hour, but I have travelled directly from Yorkshire upon a matter of the most peculiar and disturbing nature. My name is Colonel Sebastian Ashworth, recently retired from Her Majesty's Indian Service, and I come to you because every other explanation I have considered fails to account for what has occurred." Holmes had turned from the window the moment our visitor entered, and I observed that transformation I had witnessed countless times before, the melancholy scholar becoming the alert hunter in an instant. He gestured toward the chair opposite mine with a graceful economy of movement, his grey eyes already conducting that rapid examination of dress, bearing, and detail that so often yielded remarkable conclusions. "Please, Colonel Ashworth, do sit down and warm yourself by the fire. Mrs. Hudson, might we have tea for our guest? Watson, would you be so kind as to take the Colonel's cloak?" Holmes's voice had assumed that tone of focused courtesy that indicated his complete attention had been engaged. "I perceive you have indeed come directly from Yorkshire. The distinctive red clay upon your boots is particular to the region around Whitby, unless I am much mistaken. The urgency of your journey is evident from the fact that you have not stopped to change your travelling clothes, or even to take a proper meal, judging from the untouched luncheon napkin still tucked partially into your waistcoat pocket. You travelled by rail, naturally, and I would venture to suggest you departed Yorkshire early this morning to arrive at this hour, which indicates the matter weighs heavily enough upon your mind to justify considerable expense and discomfort." The Colonel had paused in the act of settling into the offered chair, his expression shifting from distress to astonishment. "Remarkable," he murmured, finally seating himself and extending his hands toward the fire's warmth. "Your reputation does not exaggerate your abilities, Mr. Holmes. Yes, everything you have said is precisely accurate. I departed Whitby at first light, and the matter has indeed allowed me neither rest nor appetite." Mrs. Hudson returned with her characteristic efficiency, bearing a tray laden with a steaming teapot, fresh cups, and a plate of her excellent shortbread. The domestic ritual of tea service provided a moment of calm as I poured for our guest, observing how the simple warmth of the cup seemed to steady his hands and ease some small measure of tension from his shoulders. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and the fire crackled softly in the grate, consuming a fresh log I had added moments before. Holmes had moved to occupy the chair directly across from the Colonel, his body angled forward with that peculiar intensity of focus that seemed to create an invisible connection between himself and those who sought his assistance. His fingers formed a steeple beneath his chin, a gesture I had long ago learned indicated his complete attention and analytical engagement. "Pray tell us your story, Colonel," Holmes said quietly. "Begin at the beginning. Omit no detail, however trivial it may seem, and allow the narrative to unfold at its natural pace. Watson and I have nowhere more pressing to be this evening than in this very room, listening to whatever mystery has driven you through such inclement weather to seek our assistance. Colonel Ashworth took a long sip of his tea, gathering his thoughts, and when he began to speak, his voice had settled into the measured cadence of a man accustomed to delivering clear reports under difficult circumstances. 3 weeks ago, I received an invitation from an old comrade of mine, Captain Edmund Hartley, to join him for a winter retreat at his family estate in Yorkshire. Hartley and I served together in India for nearly a decade, and though we have maintained a regular correspondence since my return to England 5 years past, I had not actually seen him in person for some considerable time. The invitation was warmly phrased and mentioned that several other former officers would be in attendance, making it something of a military reunion, combined with a respite from London's winter gloom. He paused to take another sip of tea, his gaze distant as he recalled the events. The firelight played across his weathered features, casting shadows that deepened the lines care and time had etched there. I accepted naturally and arrived at Hartley Manor on the evening of January 15th. The estate is situated in a rather remote location, approximately 12 miles inland from Whitby, surrounded by moorland that takes on a particularly desolate aspect during winter months. The manor itself is a substantial stone structure dating from the late 17th century, all Gothic arches and leaded windows, the sort of place that seems to absorb rather than reflect light. Rather atmospheric, though I must confess such aesthetic considerations meant little to me at the time. I was simply pleased at the prospect of good company and the comfort of a country house. Holmes shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes never leaving the Colonel's face. How many guests were present? 7 in total, including myself, Ashworth replied. Captain Hartley, of course, serving as our host, Major William Blackwood, whom I had known slightly in India, Dr. Thomas Ashford, the regiment's former physician, Lieutenant Peter Granville, a younger officer who had served during the final years of my posting. There were also 2 civilians, Hartley's cousin, a scholarly gentleman named Jonathan Blackthorne, who apparently possessed considerable knowledge of local history, and a Mr. Edward Finch, who was described as a consultant on matters of antiquities. Lastly, there was Hartley's sister, Miss Catherine Hartley, who served as hostess in the absence of a wife, Captain Hartley being a confirmed bachelor. The Colonel set down his teacup with a soft click of porcelain against porcelain, and I observed a slight tremor in his hand as he did so. Outside, a particularly strong gust of wind drove rain against the windows with renewed force, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour, 9 deep, sonorous notes that seemed to sink into the room's shadows. The first 3 days passed pleasantly enough, Ashworth continued. We dined well, shared reminiscences of our service years, took walks across the moor when weather permitted, and generally enjoyed the sort of comfortable companionship that forms between men who have endured shared hardships. Hartley proved an excellent host, and the manor, though architecturally severe, was comfortably appointed within. It was on the 4th day, January 19th, that the situation began to develop its peculiar character. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping, though we were entirely alone, save for the 3 of us and the crackling fire. Captain Hartley announced that evening that he had arranged a special excursion for the following day. He had secured passage for our entire party aboard a private rail carriage. Something, he emphasized, had required considerable expense and planning. For a journey north, into the most remote reaches of the Yorkshire moors. He would not elaborate on our destination, despite numerous inquiries, saying only that he wished to show us something of extraordinary historical significance that he had recently discovered during his own explorations of the region. Holmes's fingers drummed a soft rhythm against the arm of his chair, a gesture I recognized as indicating heightened interest. "Did this announcement strike you as unusual, Colonel?" "In retrospect, yes," Ashworth acknowledged. At the time, however, we were all simply intrigued and somewhat amused by Hartley's insistence on maintaining the surprise. He had always possessed a somewhat theatrical nature, a fondness for dramatic gestures, so his behaviour seemed consistent with his character. We retired that evening in a spirit of pleasant anticipation, none of us harbouring any suspicion of what was to follow. The fire had burned down somewhat, so I rose to add another log, taking care to position it properly among the glowing coals. The wood caught immediately, releasing a shower of sparks up the chimney, and filling the room with renewed warmth and light. Mrs. Hudson appeared at that moment with fresh hot water for the teapot, her presence a comfortable domestic intrusion that somehow deepened rather than disturbed the atmosphere of quiet attention that had settled over our gathering. Once I had refreshed the Colonel's cup and resumed my seat, he continued his narrative, his voice maintaining that steady, measured quality, despite the evident strain the recollection imposed. We assembled the following morning after an early breakfast. The weather had turned decidedly cold overnight, and frost covered the moor grass like a coating of powdered glass. 2 carriages transported us to a small station some miles from the manor, not the main Whitby line, but rather a local spur that I had not previously known existed, serving what appeared to be primarily freight and occasional private transport into the more inaccessible regions. The station itself was little more than a platform and a small waiting room, tended by a single elderly station master who seemed entirely unsurprised by our arrival, suggesting Hartley had indeed made thorough arrangements. The Colonel paused to sip his tea, and I noticed how the warmth and comfort of our rooms, combined with the act of narration itself, seemed to be gradually easing the tension that had gripped him upon arrival. His shoulders had relaxed slightly, and though the troubled expression remained in his eyes, his voice had grown steadier. The private carriage awaited us on a siding, a single passenger car of older design but well maintained, attached to a small locomotive with a 2-man crew whom Hartley greeted by name. The interior of the carriage had been prepared with considerable attention to comfort. Upholstered benches along both sides, small tables by the windows, oil lamps already lit against the grey morning, and even provisions for tea and refreshment during our journey. Hartley remained in excellent spirits, clearly pleased with the arrangements and amused by our continued speculation regarding our destination. Holmes rose from his chair with that sudden fluid movement characteristic of his energized states, crossing to the shelf where he kept his tobacco and pipe. As he filled the bowl with practiced fingers, he spoke without turning. "Describe the carriage's layout more precisely, if you would. How were the occupants positioned relative to one another?" "The benches ran longitudinally," Ashworth explained, "so that passengers faced each other across the central aisle rather than all facing forward. On one side sat Captain Hartley at the forward end, then his cousin Jonathan Blackthorne, then Dr. Ashford, and finally Lieutenant Granville at the rear. On the opposite bench sat Miss Catherine Hartley at the forward position nearest her brother, then Major Blackwood, then Mr. Finch, and myself at the rear position. The arrangement allowed for conversation and observation, though the carriage's motion and the noise of travel made extended dialogue somewhat challenging once we were underway. Holmes returned to his chair, now wreathed in fragrant pipe smoke that drifted lazily toward the ceiling. And the journey itself. Describe the landscape, the duration, any notable features or stops. The Colonel's expression grew distant as he recalled the scene. We departed shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. The initial portion of our journey carried us northward across open moorland, that vast, undulating landscape of heather and gorse that characterizes the Yorkshire uplands. The morning remained grey and cold, with low clouds obscuring the higher elevations and creating an atmosphere of considerable isolation. Occasionally, we would pass through small valleys where bare-branched trees clustered along frozen streams, or cross ancient stone bridges, spanning ravines cut deep into the moor by centuries of runoff. He set down his cup and spread his hands as if trying to capture something elusive. The quality of light was peculiar that day, neither fully overcast nor clear, but rather suffused with a sort of silvery dimness that made distances difficult to judge, and lent every landmark a slightly unreal appearance. We saw no other signs of human habitation for the first hour of travel, only the occasional ruin of a stone cottage or sheepfold, long abandoned to the elements. I found myself drawn entirely into the narrative, imagining that cold carriage rolling through desolate landscape, the small party of travellers warm within their conveyance, while the bleak moor stretched away on all sides. The scene had a dreamlike quality, enhanced by the late hour and the comfortable drowsiness that our warm room induced. After approximately 90 minutes, the Colonel continued, we began to climb more steeply. The locomotive laboured somewhat, and our pace slowed considerably. We entered a region of more dramatic topography. Rocky outcroppings began to appear, thrusting up through the moorland like ancient bones breaking through flesh. Captain Hartley became more animated at this point, moving from window to window and pointing out various features of the landscape, though he still would not reveal our ultimate destination. A log in the fireplace shifted suddenly, sending up a small fountain of sparks and causing all three of us to glance toward the hearth. The momentary interruption seemed to underscore the narrative's tension, and when the Colonel resumed speaking, his voice had dropped even lower. It was approaching 10 o'clock when we entered the tunnel. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You had not been informed a tunnel lay ahead? No mention had been made of it, Ashworth confirmed. The locomotive's whistle sounded twice, a long, mournful note that echoed across the moor, and then, quite suddenly, we were plunged into darkness. I say darkness, though in truth, the oil lamps continued to illuminate the carriage interior. It was rather that all external light vanished instantly, replaced by the close stone walls of the tunnel, rushing past our windows, and the altered quality of sound that accompanies enclosed spaces. The tunnel's acoustic properties magnified and distorted every noise. The wheels upon the rails became a thunderous drumming. The locomotive's exhalations echoed and reverberated, and any conversation became nearly impossible due to the overwhelming cacophony. He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his collar as if the remembered confinement still affected him. The tunnel seemed to go on far longer than one might expect. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15, and still we continued our subterranean progress through what must have been a considerable mountain or ridge of elevated moorland. The air grew noticeably colder, and that peculiar smell of ancient stone and underground places began to permeate the carriage despite its sealed windows. Holmes drew deeply upon his pipe, the ember glowing bright in the room's comfortable dimness. Rain continued to fall beyond our windows, though perhaps somewhat more gently now, and the clock upon the mantel ticked steadily onward through the evening hours. I realized that I had lost track of time entirely, drawn so completely into the Colonel's narrative that the passing minutes had become irrelevant. When we finally emerged from the tunnel, Ashworth said, and something in his voice suggested this moment marked a crucial transition in his tale. We found ourselves in a landscape entirely different from the one we had left behind. Instead of open moorland, we were now travelling through a narrow valley, walled on both sides by steep, rocky slopes that rose into the grey sky like the sides of an enormous trench. Snow lay upon the ground here, not the mere frost we had seen earlier, but actual accumulated snow of several inches depth that had apparently fallen and remained in this sheltered location. The temperature had dropped markedly, and when Dr. Ashford consulted his pocket thermometer, he announced with some surprise that it registered several degrees below freezing, notably colder than conditions had been on the far side of the tunnel. The Colonel accepted a fresh cup of tea from me, with a grateful nod before continuing. The transformation was quite remarkable, and somewhat disorienting. It felt as though we had passed not merely through a mountain, but into some other season entirely, or perhaps into a pocket of geography that operated according to different meteorological rules than the surrounding landscape. Captain Hartley noticed our reactions and smiled with evident satisfaction, saying, "Welcome, gentleman and lady, to the Deepfell Valley, a location known to very few and visited by fewer still." Holmes had been listening with that absolute stillness that characterized his moments of deepest concentration, but now he stirred slightly. "The Deepfell Valley," he murmured. "I have encountered references to that location in certain historical documents relating to the medieval period. If memory serves, it was mentioned in connection with monastic settlements, and, more obliquely, with certain pre-Christian ritual sites, a place of considerable archaeological significance, though I was not aware any railway penetrated to that region." "Nor was I," the Colonel agreed, "nor, I suspect, were any of my fellow passengers." Hartley explained that the rail line we travelled had been constructed some 40 years previously to serve a mining operation that was subsequently abandoned due to various practical difficulties. The tunnel and track had been maintained in minimal fashion, primarily for occasional freight transport, and, very rarely, for private excursions such as ours. He had discovered the possibility quite by chance during his own explorations, and had conceived the notion of bringing our party to see what he had found there. The Colonel's hands tightened around his teacup, and for the first time since beginning his narrative, a note of something approaching fear entered his voice. We travelled down that valley for another 20 minutes, moving slowly due to the condition of the track and the accumulated snow. The walls on either side seemed to grow higher and closer as we progressed, creating an increasingly oppressive sense of enclosure. No vegetation was visible, save for the occasional dark evergreen clinging to the rocky slopes, and no birds or other wildlife could be seen. The valley had an utterly desolate, abandoned quality that began to affect the mood of our party. Even Miss Catherine Hartley, who had maintained cheerful spirits throughout the journey, grew quiet and withdrawn. He paused to sip his tea, and I took the opportunity to add another log to the fire, which had again begun to burn low. The addition of fuel created a pleasant crackling and sent renewed warmth spreading through our comfortable room, a stark contrast to the increasingly cold and inhospitable landscape the Colonel's words were painting. Finally, we rounded a curve in the valley, and our destination came into view. Ashworth continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. At the valley's far end, where the rocky walls converged to form what appeared to be an impassable terminus, stood the ruins of what must once have been a substantial structure, a monastery or fortress. It was impossible to determine which, so thoroughly had time and weather reduced it. Walls of dark stone rose 3 or 4 stories in places, pierced by empty window frames that stared down like sightless eyes. A single tower remained partially intact, jutting up against the grey sky like an accusing finger. Snow had drifted against the walls and accumulated upon every horizontal surface, giving the entire scene a peculiar beauty despite its desolation. Holmes had risen again and now stood by the window, though his attention remained focused entirely upon our guest. This was Hartley's destination? These ruins? Yes, the Colonel confirmed. The train slowed to a halt at what appeared to be the end of the line, quite literally, as the rails simply stopped some 100 yards from the ruins. A small platform of old timber construction provided a place to disembark, though it was clear from the snow accumulation that no one had visited this location in quite some time. Hartley was first out of the carriage, his excitement palpable as he gestured for us to follow. "Come," he called back to us. "I have the most extraordinary discovery to show you within these walls, something that will rewrite certain aspects of local history, and perhaps shed light on mysteries that have puzzled scholars for centuries." The Colonel's expression had grown increasingly troubled as his narrative progressed, and now he set down his cup with an unsteady hand. We all disembarked, naturally, though I confess several of us, myself included, harboured some reservations about venturing into what appeared to be a potentially dangerous structure of uncertain stability. The cold was intense, far more severe than we had anticipated when departing the manor that morning, and our clothing, though suitable for a winter journey, proved inadequate for the frigid conditions that prevailed in that isolated valley. He drew a deep breath before continuing. Hartley led us across the snow toward the ruin's main entrance, a massive doorway whose wooden doors had long since rotted away, leaving only the stone arch and threshold. He produced from his coat pocket a number of oil lanterns he had thoughtfully brought for the purpose, and distributed them among us, then led the way inside with a confidence that suggested he had previously explored these precincts thoroughly, and knew them to be safe. The Colonel's voice had taken on a distant quality, as if he were no longer truly present in our warm Baker Street room, but instead walking once more through those ancient frozen corridors. I found myself leaning forward in my chair, entirely absorbed in his tale, while the rain outside had diminished to the merest whisper against the windows. The interior was vast, a series of interconnected chambers and corridors whose original purpose could only be guessed at. Our footsteps echoed on stone floors, partially covered with accumulated snow and debris. Our lanterns cast wild, dancing shadows that seemed to move with independent life in the periphery of vision. The cold within was somehow even more intense than without, possessing that particular bone-deep quality that characterizes places long closed away from warmth and human presence. Holmes returned to his seat, relighting his pipe, which had gone out during his brief perambulation. The tobacco smoke seemed to curl and twist in patterns that momentarily resembled the shapes the Colonel's words were conjuring in my imagination. Dark corridors, dancing lantern light, ancient stones holding centuries of silence. Hartley guided us deeper into the structure, Ashworth continued, maintaining a running commentary about the ruins' probable age and origin. He believed them to date from the 13th century, constructed by an obscure monastic order whose name had been largely lost to history. He spoke of records he had uncovered in Whitby's archives, suggesting the monastery had been abandoned quite suddenly under mysterious circumstances, with various local legends attributing its desertion to everything from plague to supernatural intervention. The Colonel paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, or perhaps his courage, before proceeding with the next portion of his account. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the building a door closed with a distant, muffled sound. The familiar noises of Baker Street at night provided a comforting counterpoint to the increasingly strange tale unfolding before us. After perhaps 20 minutes of exploration through these outer chambers, we descended a stone stairway that led below ground level. The stairs were worn smooth by countless feet over countless years, and we proceeded with considerable caution, mindful of the ice that had formed in places where water had seeped through the ancient masonry. Down we went, deeper into the earth, our collective breath visible as clouds of vapour in the lantern light, until we reached what Hartley announced was the monastery's crypt, or undercroft. Ashworth's hands had begun to tremble slightly, and I noticed Holmes observing this detail with his characteristic keen attention. The detective said nothing, however, allowing the narrative to proceed at its own pace, understanding that the act of telling itself was serving some therapeutic purpose for our agitated visitor. The undercroft was a substantial chamber, perhaps 60 feet in length and 30 feet in breadth, with a vaulted ceiling supported by thick stone pillars. Along the walls, barely visible in our inadequate light, we could discern carved reliefs and inscriptions, whose meaning was not immediately apparent. The floor was flagstone, and in its centre stood what appeared to be a stone altar or table of some antiquity, its surface marked with designs that even in the uncertain light seemed oddly disturbing. The Colonel lifted his gaze to meet Holmes's eyes directly. It was here that Captain Hartley revealed the true purpose of our excursion. From beneath a canvas covering near one wall, he produced several objects he had clearly positioned during an earlier visit. They were artifacts, Mr. Holmes, metal objects of extraordinary craftsmanship and evident age. There were ceremonial blades with inscribed hilts, a chalice or cup of unusual design, several pieces that might have been components of ritual vestments, and most striking of all, a large circular disc of what appeared to be silver, or some silver alloy, its surface covered entirely with symbols that none of us could interpret. Holmes leaned forward with renewed intensity. Did you examine these objects closely? Can you describe the symbols in greater detail? I did examine them, though the light was poor and the cold had become nearly unbearable. The Colonel replied. The symbols were unlike any writing I had encountered during my years abroad. Not Latin, not Greek, certainly nothing from the Eastern scripts I had learned to recognize during my Indian service. They seemed to combine geometric shapes with more organic, flowing forms, creating patterns that were somehow unsettling to regard for extended periods. Several of my companions remarked upon feeling oddly disturbed by the sight of them, though no one could articulate precisely why. He shifted in his chair, seeking a more comfortable position, and I used the momentary pause to rise and draw the curtains more fully closed, shutting out the dark, wet night and creating an even more intimate atmosphere within our lampled room. The gesture seemed to hearten the colonel slightly, providing additional insulation from both literal cold and the metaphorical chill of his disturbing memories. Captain Hartley was in a state of tremendous excitement, explaining that he believed these artifacts predated the monastery itself, that the medieval monks had perhaps discovered them during their own occupation of the site, and had incorporated them into their practices, or possibly had come to this remote location precisely because these objects were already present, representing some older tradition or belief system the monks sought to preserve or study. Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe. Did Captain Hartley indicate how he had discovered these items? Had they been concealed, or were they simply lying about the crypt awaiting discovery? He said he had found them while conducting his own explorations of the ruins several weeks prior, Ashworth explained. According to his account, they had been hidden within a hollow space behind one of the wall carvings, a deliberate concealment, but one that time and the partial collapse of a section of masonry had revealed. He had spent subsequent weeks researching what he could find in local archives, which had led him to conclude that these objects possessed significant historical importance beyond their evident material value. The colonel's expression had grown even more troubled, and he glanced toward our windows, as if concerned that something might be observing from the darkness beyond. We spent perhaps an hour in that underground chamber, while Hartley explained his theories and showed us various features of the artifacts. Major Blackwood, who possessed some knowledge of metallurgy, examined several pieces and declared the workmanship to be of exceptional quality, though he could not determine the precise composition of the metals used. Mr. Finch, the antiquities consultant, grew increasingly animated, suggesting that these might be connected to various mystery cults known to have operated in Britain during the late Roman period or early medieval era. He paused, and when he resumed speaking, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. It was young Lieutenant Granville who first remarked upon the cold, not merely the general cold of that frozen place, but rather a specific, local intensification of cold that seemed to be emanating from the vicinity of the altar stone and the artifacts arranged upon it. At first, we dismissed this as imagination, or perhaps some natural phenomenon related to air circulation in the underground space. But within minutes, we all became aware of it, a coldness that seemed to penetrate deeper than mere low temperature, creating a sensation almost of being drained of warmth from within. The fire in our grate had burned down considerably, and I rose once more to tend it, but found that despite adding fresh coal and arranging it properly, the flames seemed reluctant to achieve their former vigor. A cold draught had somehow entered our normally well-sealed room, and I noticed both Holmes and the colonel pull their garments more closely about themselves. Miss Catherine Hartley was the first to suggest we return to the surface, Ashworth continued. She had grown pale and complained of feeling unwell, not severely so, but enough to cause concern. Her brother was reluctant to abbreviate our exploration, but the combined requests of several of us convinced him to gather up the artifacts, return them to their concealment, and lead us back up the worn stone steps toward daylight. The Colonel's hands gripped the arms of his chair as if steadying himself. We emerged from the ruins to discover that the weather had deteriorated significantly during our time underground. Snow had begun to fall, not gently, but with that sudden intensity that characterizes the most severe winter storms. The wind had risen, driving the snow horizontally across the valley and creating conditions of near whiteout. Our locomotive and carriage, which had been clearly visible when we disembarked, were now barely discernible through the swirling white chaos. Holmes rose and moved to stand before the fireplace, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. A sudden storm in such a location could indeed prove dangerous. I presume you made haste to return to the relative safety and warmth of the carriage. We attempted to do precisely that, the Colonel confirmed, his voice tight with remembered anxiety. Hartley led the way, following our original tracks through the snow, though these were rapidly being obliterated by the fresh accumulation and the wind's fury. The distance was not great, perhaps 100 yards, yet it seemed to stretch endlessly as we struggled forward against wind that seemed almost deliberately opposed to our progress. He drew a shuddering breath before continuing. We had covered perhaps half the distance when Dr. Ashford, who had been assisting Miss Catherine, and therefore moving somewhat behind the main group, called out sharply. We turned to see him standing alone, looking about in obvious confusion. Miss Catherine Hartley had been directly beside him not a moment before, but in that brief interval of time when the snow had been at its thickest and visibility at its absolute minimum, she had somehow become separated from our party and vanished into the white chaos surrounding us. A log in our fireplace collapsed suddenly, sending up a shower of sparks and causing all three of us to start slightly at the unexpected sound. The moment passed, but the tension in our room had markedly increased. Captain Hartley immediately organized a search, of course, the Colonel said. Despite the dangerous conditions, we could not simply abandon his sister to the storm. We spread out as much as we dared while maintaining vocal contact with one another, calling Miss Catherine's name and searching in all directions. The locomotive crew joined us, bringing additional lanterns, though these provided little help in the blinding snowfall. We searched for nearly half an hour, growing increasingly desperate and increasingly aware that we ourselves were at considerable risk of becoming lost or succumbing to the extreme cold. Holmes had returned to his seat, his expression grave. But you did not find her. We found no trace whatsoever, Ashworth replied, his voice hollow with the weight of this admission. No footprints, no sign of passage, no indication of which direction she might have gone. It was as if she had simply been erased from existence in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Eventually, Captain Hartley, and I could see it nearly broke him to make this decision, acknowledged that we were achieving nothing except endangering the entire party. He ordered us back to the carriage, intending to seek immediate help from the nearest settlement once we had emerged from that cursed valley. The Colonel leaned forward, his face a mask of anguish and confusion. We boarded the carriage, and the locomotive began its laborious journey back down the valley toward the tunnel. The storm continued unabated, and visibility remained near zero. It was, I think, the longest 20 minutes of my life, sitting in that carriage knowing we were leaving Miss Catherine behind, yet recognizing we had no practical alternative. Captain Hartley sat in a state of shock, staring at nothing, his earlier excitement transformed into something approaching catalepsy. The rain outside our windows had stopped entirely now, leaving a profound silence, broken only by the ticking clock and the soft sounds of settling coals in the grate. Mrs. Hudson appeared briefly to inquire whether we required anything further, and though Holmes politely declined, I noticed his attention never wavered from our visitor during even this brief interruption. "We entered the tunnel," the Colonel said, his voice now quite faint, "and proceeded through that echoing darkness that had seemed merely noteworthy during our outward journey, but now felt actively oppressive and threatening. The sounds were even more overwhelming than before, whether due to some change in the locomotive's operation or simply our heightened state of anxiety, I cannot say. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 25, and still we continued through unbroken blackness. He looked up at Holmes with an expression of such profound bewilderment that I felt a sympathetic chill run down my spine despite the fire's warmth. "Mr. Holmes, we never emerged from that tunnel. We travelled through it for more than an hour, far longer than the 15 minutes our outward journey had required. The tunnel seemed to have somehow extended itself, or we had entered some loop from which there was no exit. The crew eventually stopped the locomotive, confused and alarmed, and after consultation attempted to reverse course and return to the valley we had departed. Holmes's eyebrows had risen dramatically. With what result? After travelling in reverse for approximately the same duration, Ashworth said slowly, we found ourselves emerging not into the Deepfell Valley, but rather into a different valley entirely, one none of us recognised. The storm had passed, the sky had cleared to reveal afternoon light, and we found ourselves at what appeared to be an abandoned station platform, in a location utterly unknown to any of us, including the locomotive crew who had operated in that region for years. The Colonel's voice had taken on a quality of numb disbelief. We consulted maps, questioned the bewildered crew, examined our surroundings for any identifying landmarks. Eventually, we determined that we had somehow emerged at a location approximately 40 miles east of where we should have been, 40 miles from any point along the route we had travelled that morning. The entire geography had simply reconfigured itself around us. Holmes had gone very still, his keen mind clearly working to process these remarkable claims. I found myself struggling to maintain the objective perspective my medical training encouraged. Yet the Colonel's evident sincerity and genuine distress made dismissing his account as mere confusion or fabrication nearly impossible. After considerable difficulty and delay, Ashworth continued, we managed to make our way to a small market town where we could arrange alternative transportation. By this time, it was evening, and the events of the day had left us all in a state approaching shock. Captain Hartley was inconsolable regarding his sister's disappearance, and became fixated on the idea that we must return immediately to the Deepfell Valley and resume the search. The Colonel took a long sip from his now cold tea before continuing. Here is where the situation becomes even more inexplicable, Mr. Holmes. Over the following 2 days, Captain Hartley organised a proper search expedition. local men familiar with the region, police from Whitby, experienced moorland guides. He led them to what he insisted was the access point for the railway that had carried us into the Deepfell Valley. He paused, and silence stretched between us. The railway did not exist. The tunnel did not exist. There was no rail line, no station platform, no evidence that any such infrastructure had ever been constructed in that location. Local residents, including men who had lived in the area their entire lives, insisted that no railway had ever penetrated to the region Captain Hartley described. The moorland he indicated stood unbroken and untouched, without even old railbeds or construction scars to suggest anything had ever been built there. Holmes rose again, beginning to pace with those long, energetic strides that indicated his mind working at its highest capacity. Surely the other passengers could corroborate Captain Hartley's account. There were multiple witnesses to your journey. That is precisely the heart of the mystery that has driven me to seek your counsel, the Colonel said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. When I attempted to confirm details with my fellow passengers, I discovered that each recalled the day's events differently, not in minor details, but in fundamental aspects. Major Blackwood insisted we had never entered any tunnel, that we had travelled overland by carriage to an entirely different location, where a minor accident occurred that he described quite distinctly, though it bore no resemblance to what I remembered. Lieutenant Granville claimed the excursion had been cancelled due to weather, and that we had spent the day at Hartley Manor engaged in various indoor pursuits. He spread his hands in a gesture of complete bewilderment. Dr. Ashford's account most closely matched my own, yet even he diverged on significant points, insisting that Miss Catherine Hartley had never joined our expedition and had remained at the manor throughout. Mr. Finch departed for London immediately after the incident, or what I believe was the incident, and I have been unable to contact him for his perspective. Jonathan Blackthorne, Hartley's cousin, suffered what appears to have been a complete nervous collapse, and has been under a physician's care, unable or unwilling to discuss the events in any coherent fashion. The room had grown notably colder despite our fire, and I noticed both Holmes and myself had drawn closer to the hearth's warmth. The Colonel continued, his words tumbling out now with the urgency of someone who had long carried a burden too heavy to bear alone. Captain Hartley himself has become a man possessed, Mr. Holmes. He insists his sister vanished from that valley, and he continues to search, though every inquiry demonstrates that the railway, the tunnel, the valley itself, none of these things exist in any documented or verifiable form. He has exhausted his financial resources, hiring guides, and making repeated expeditions into increasingly remote regions of the moor. His mental state has deteriorated to the point where his remaining family members have begun discussing the possibility of seeking medical intervention. Holmes stopped his pacing and fixed the Colonel with an intense gaze. "And you, Colonel Ashworth, what do you believe happened during that journey?" The Colonel met Holmes's eyes with evident difficulty. "I believe I experienced precisely what I have described to you, Mr. Holmes. Yet I cannot reconcile my memories with the physical evidence, or rather, the absence thereof. I have returned to the location multiple times myself, and I can find no trace of the railway or station that I am certain I saw and boarded. I have questioned local residents, consulted historical archives, examined railway company records. Nothing corroborates what I remember with perfect clarity. Either something extraordinary occurred that defies rational explanation, or I have suffered some form of shared delusion, perhaps induced by carbon monoxide poisoning during our journey, or... He trailed off, seemingly unable to articulate the other possibilities his mind had contemplated. Or the event occurred in some fashion that suggests the nature of reality itself may be more fluid than we commonly accept. Holmes finished quietly. He returned to his chair and sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers once again forming that characteristic steeple beneath his chin. I took the opportunity to refresh the tea, though my hands, I noticed, were less than perfectly steady as I poured. The story the Colonel had related possessed a quality that unsettled something fundamental in my understanding of the world. That combination of specific detail and impossible circumstance that neither permitted easy dismissal nor suggested obvious explanation. "Colonel Ashworth," Holmes said at last, "I am prepared to accept this commission and investigate the circumstances you have described, unusual though they may be. However, I must be frank with you regarding my approach. While I do not categorically dismiss any possibility until evidence warrants such dismissal, my investigative method proceeds from the assumption that rational explanations exist for all phenomena, however extraordinary they may initially appear. What seems supernatural or impossible is invariably the result of circumstances we have not yet understood rather than evidence of reality operating contrary to its established principles." The Colonel nodded slowly. "I ask only that you apply your renowned faculties to this puzzle, Mr. Holmes. Whether the explanation proves to be mundane or extraordinary, I must know the truth. The not knowing has begun to erode my own confidence in my mental faculties, and Captain Hartley is destroying himself in his obsessive search for his sister. Some resolution must be achieved, or I fear for both his sanity and my own." Holmes rose and extended his hand. "Return to your lodgings and get some rest, Colonel. You have travelled far and related a difficult tale. Watson and I will make arrangements to travel to Yorkshire tomorrow. I will need you to guide us to the location where you believe this railway station existed, and to facilitate introductions to Captain Hartley and the other principals in this affair. Can you accommodate these requirements?" "Gladly, Mr. Holmes," the Colonel replied, standing and accepting the handshake with visible relief. "I have taken rooms in London for the night, and can be ready to depart at whatever hour you specify. Simply having someone of your reputation willing to seriously investigate has already eased a considerable burden from my mind." After seeing the Colonel to the door and hearing his footsteps descend our 17 stairs, I returned to find Holmes standing before the fire, staring into the flames with an expression I had learned to recognize as indicating deep cogitation. "Well, Watson," he said, without turning, "what is your medical opinion? Have we been visited by a man suffering delusions, or by a sane individual describing an experience that defies conventional explanation?" I considered the question carefully before responding. His physical presentation suggests genuine distress rather than the disconnection from reality one typically observes in patients experiencing psychotic episodes. His narrative was internally consistent and detailed in a manner more characteristic of actual memory than of confabulation. Yet the content of his account... "Quite so," Holmes agreed, turning to face me. "The content strains credulity to its breaking point. Yet something clearly occurred that has left multiple individuals severely disturbed, and has resulted in the apparent disappearance of a young woman. Even if we discount the more extraordinary elements, tunnels that change length, railways that cease to exist, valleys that cannot be found, we are still left with a missing person and several witnesses who have experienced significant psychological trauma. That alone warrants investigation. He moved to the window and drew back the curtain to gaze out upon Baker Street's wet, glistening cobblestones. What troubles me most is the element of divergent memory among the witnesses. If all participants were describing the same hallucinatory experience, one might attribute it to environmental factors, toxic gases, perhaps, or contaminated food affecting the entire party. But for each person to remember different events suggests either a more complex form of psychological influence or... He paused, seeming reluctant to complete the thought. Or what, Holmes? I prompted. Or we are dealing with something that operates according to principles we do not yet understand, he finished quietly. But let us not speculate prematurely. Tomorrow we travel north, and evidence will either confirm or refute the Colonel's remarkable account. For tonight, I suggest we both get what rest we can. Something tells me the coming days will require our full faculties. I retired to my room shortly thereafter, though sleep proved elusive. My mind kept returning to the Colonel's tale. That train moving through falling snow, into a valley that might not exist. Those ancient ruins concealing artifacts of unknown origin. And most haunting of all, a young woman who had vanished between one moment and the next into a white storm that had perhaps blown from somewhere beyond the boundaries of the mapped world. The morning arrived cold and grey, with frost coating the windows of our railway compartment as we departed King's Cross bound for York. Colonel Ashworth had arrived at Baker Street punctually at 8 o'clock, looking somewhat refreshed by a night's rest, but still carrying that shadow of anxiety that had marked his features during the previous evening's interview. Holmes had been characteristically energetic, having apparently spent the early hours reviewing what references he could find regarding the Deepfell Valley, the surrounding region's history, and railway construction in the remote reaches of Yorkshire. We travelled in relative silence, Holmes alternating between consulting a sheaf of documents he had brought and staring out the window at the passing landscape with that distant expression that indicated active mental engagement. I attempted to read a medical journal I had brought for the journey, but found my attention wandering repeatedly to contemplate the strange investigation upon which we were embarked. The Colonel spent much of the journey gazing out his own window, occasionally pointing out landmarks as we progressed northward through the winter countryside. By mid-afternoon, we had reached York, where we changed trains for the smaller local service to Whitby. The landscape grew progressively more rugged and desolate as we travelled eastward, the populated lowlands giving way to the vast moorlands that characterise that region. The sky had remained overcast throughout our journey, and as we approached the coast, a cold wind began to drive occasional flurries of snow against our carriage windows. We arrived in Whitby as early winter evening was descending, the ancient port town perched dramatically between the sea and the towering ruins of its famous abbey. Colonel Ashworth had arranged accommodation for us at a respectable inn overlooking the harbour, where warm fires and a substantial meal provided welcome relief from the day's cold travel. Tomorrow, I propose we visit Captain Hartley, Holmes announced, as we sat in the inn's comfortable parlour after dinner, warming ourselves before a generous hearth. I wish to take his direct testimony while the details remain fresh in his memory, such as it is. Following that interview, we shall proceed to this supposed location of the vanished railway station and conduct a thorough examination of the site. Colonel, I trust you can guide us there without difficulty. I believe so, Mr. Holmes, Ashworth replied, though his tone suggested less certainty than his words. I have been there multiple times since the incident, and while each visit leaves me more confused than the last, I am confident I can find the general location where I believe we departed that morning. Excellent, Holmes said, pulling out his pipe and beginning the familiar ritual of filling it. Watson, I shall require your observational skills tomorrow. Particular attention should be paid to the Colonel's reactions and certainty as we approach and examine the site. I wish to determine whether we are dealing with a case of false memory, deliberate deception, or something altogether more unusual. I nodded my understanding, though privately I wondered whether even Holmes's formidable analytical abilities would prove sufficient to unravel a mystery as strange as the one we had come to investigate. That night, I lay awake in my room, listening to the wind howl off the North Sea and rattle the inn's windows. The sound was lonely and somehow unsettling, carrying with it hints of vast, cold spaces and mysteries that lurked just beyond the reach of human understanding. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I slept, though my dreams were troubled by images of trains moving through endless tunnels toward destinations that shifted and changed even as one approached them. Morning brought clearer weather, though the cold remained intense. After a substantial breakfast, we hired a trap and set out to visit Captain Hartley's manor. The journey carried us inland from Whitby, climbing steadily into the moorland that stretched away in all directions beneath a pale sky. The landscape possessed a stark beauty, vast expanses of heather and gorse, broken by rocky outcroppings, and the occasional stand of wind-twisted trees clustered in sheltered valleys. Hartley Manor came into view after approximately an hour's travel, exactly as Colonel Ashworth had described, a substantial Gothic structure of dark stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the winter light. The building's architecture spoke of several centuries of gradual expansion and modification, creating an irregular profile of varying roof lines, jutting wings, and towers of different heights and styles. Smoke rose from several chimneys, suggesting the interior was at least adequately heated, despite the season's severity. We were received at the door by an elderly butler, whose expression suggested he had dealt with numerous visitors on similar errands in recent weeks, and had long since abandoned any hope of understanding the situation that had brought them. He showed us into a drawing room where a fire burned vigorously in a massive stone fireplace, the flames providing welcome warmth after our cold drive. Captain Edmund Hartley entered shortly thereafter, and I was immediately struck by the change that distress had wrought upon him. Though he could not have been much above 40 years of age, his face bore the lines and shadows of a much older man. His eyes, which must once have possessed the clear focus of an officer accustomed to command, now held a fevered, haunted quality that troubled me from a medical perspective. He greeted Colonel Ashworth with obvious warmth, but a distraction that suggested his thoughts were elsewhere, presumably with his missing sister and the inexplicable circumstances of her disappearance. "Mr. Holmes," he said, after we had been introduced and seated, "Colonel Ashworth has written to me about your willingness to investigate this matter, and I cannot adequately express my gratitude. The authorities have been... He paused, seeming to struggle for words. They have been kind, but they clearly believe I am suffering from some form of delusion or breakdown. They search perfunctorily when I plead with them, but their hearts are not in it, because they do not believe there is anything to find. They think Catherine never left the manor, that she ran away for her own reasons, or that I have simply imagined the entire journey into the Deepfell Valley. Holmes leaned forward with that intense focus I had witnessed so often. Captain Hartley, I require you to relate your experience to me in complete detail, precisely as you remember it. Take your time, omit nothing you recall, and do not concern yourself with whether particular elements seem plausible or rational. I am interested in your actual memories, not in an edited version designed to sound reasonable. Over the next 2 hours, Captain Hartley provided his account. His version of events matched Colonel Ashworth's narrative in all significant respects. The journey on the private railway carriage, the long tunnel, the strange valley beyond, the exploration of the ruins, the discovery of the mysterious artifacts, and most critically, the sudden snowstorm during which his sister Catherine vanished without trace. His voice broke when describing that moment of realization that she had disappeared, and I observed tears forming in his eyes despite his obvious efforts to maintain composure. "We searched for her, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We searched with every resource at our disposal, but it was as if she had been simply erased from existence. And then, when we attempted to return to that valley to continue the search, we found that the railway itself had vanished. The tunnel through which we had passed no longer existed. The valley was gone, as if it had never been. The men I hired to help me search looked at me with pity, Mr. Holmes, as if I were a madman describing impossible things." Holmes remained silent for a long moment after Captain Hartley finished his account. Finally, he asked, "These artifacts you discovered in the ruins. You said you returned them to their concealment before departing the crypt. Did you remove any objects, take any samples, or make any sketches of the symbols you observed?" Captain Hartley shook his head. "I intended to photograph them during a subsequent visit. I did not wish to disturb the site substantially until I had properly documented everything in situ. A decision I now bitterly regret, as I have no physical evidence to support my claims beyond my own memories and those of the handful of witnesses who were present, and even their memories do not align with mine. Regarding the other witnesses," Holmes continued, "would it be possible for Watson and myself to interview them? I understand some may be reluctant or unable to discuss the events, but any testimony we can gather would be valuable. Major Blackwood and Lieutenant Granville remain in the area and have agreed to speak with you," Captain Hartley replied. "Dr. Ashford has returned to his practice in Sussex, but could potentially be contacted by telegraph. My cousin Jonathan remains under medical care, and is, I fear, unable to provide coherent testimony at present. Mr. Finch, the antiquities consultant, has proved impossible to locate. He departed immediately after the incident, and has not responded to any of my subsequent communications." Holmes made notes in the small book he always carried. "And what of the railway crew, the station master who was present when you boarded, and the 2 men who operated the locomotive?" At this question, Captain Hartley's expression became even more distressed. "That is another inexplicable aspect of this entire affair, Mr. Holmes. I paid the crew in advance for the journey, and I distinctly remember their names and faces. Yet, when I attempted to locate them after the incident, I discovered that no one matching their descriptions works for any railway company operating in this region. The names I remembered proved to be those of men who died years ago. It is as if they too were somehow not real or not from our present time. A silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Holmes sat very still, his keen mind clearly processing this additional layer of impossibility. I found myself struggling once again to maintain rational skepticism in the face of testimony that seemed sincere yet described events that violated every principle of conventional reality. "Captain Hartley," Holmes said at last, "I will be frank with you. Your account presents significant challenges from an investigative perspective, as the very locations and events you describe appear to have no verifiable existence beyond personal memory. However, I am not yet prepared to dismiss your experience as mere delusion. Watson and I will visit the site where you believe the railway station was located and conduct a thorough examination. We will interview the other witnesses and attempt to find this Mr. Finch. We will search for any documentary evidence of the railway line's existence, the ruins you describe, and any historical records of your sister's existence and disappearance." He paused, and his voice softened slightly. "I must ask you to prepare yourself for the possibility that our investigation may not yield the answers you hope for. The truth, when we uncover it, may be painful or difficult to accept, but I promise you that we will pursue every available line of inquiry until we have exhausted all possibilities." Captain Hartley nodded, his expression grateful, despite the guarded nature of Holmes's promises. "That is all I ask, Mr. Holmes. Simply that someone with your abilities take the matter seriously and investigate thoroughly. Whatever the truth may be, however strange or terrible, it cannot be worse than this state of uncertainty I currently endure." We departed Hartley Manor shortly thereafter, with arrangements made to interview the other witnesses over the following days. As our trap carried us back toward the moor road, I observed Holmes deep in thought, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape without truly seeing it. "What do you make of it all, Holmes?" I asked, once we were well away from the manor. "I make of it that we are confronted with either an extraordinarily elaborate hoax, a case of shared psychosis affecting multiple individuals, or something that challenges our fundamental understanding of the relationship between mind, memory, and reality," he replied. "At present, I cannot determine which possibility is correct, though I confess the third option, however improbable, cannot be entirely dismissed given the consistency of testimony and the evident sincerity of those affected." He turned to look at me directly. "Tell me, Watson, as a medical man, what is your assessment of Captain Hartley's mental state?" "My own observations align with yours," Holmes agreed. "Which leaves us with the question, if he is not mad, and if he is not lying, then how do we explain the patent impossibility of what he describes? That, Watson, is the puzzle we must solve." The remainder of our return journey passed in contemplative silence, each of us absorbed in thoughts of railways that vanished, valleys that could not be found, and a young woman who had disappeared into a snowstorm that might have blown from somewhere beyond the boundaries of the known world. The following morning brought us to the site Colonel Ashworth identified as the location of the missing railway station. We had set out early, equipped with surveying tools, photographic equipment, and various instruments Holmes deemed potentially useful for a thorough investigation. The Colonel had been somewhat uncertain about the precise location, requiring several false starts and consultations of his own notes before declaring with reasonable confidence that we had reached the correct spot. The location was utterly unremarkable. A section of moorland indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape in every respect I could observe. No hint of previous construction was visible, no depression in the earth suggesting old railbeds, no scattered stones that might have formed a platform, no weathered timber remnants that could have been station buildings. The moor stretched away unbroken in all directions, covered in its winter coat of brown heather and dormant gorse, with occasional rocky outcroppings breaking the undulating surface. Holmes began a methodical examination of the area, quartering the ground in a systematic pattern while examining every detail with his magnifying lens. I watched as he knelt repeatedly to inspect particular sections of earth, scraped away surface vegetation to examine the soil beneath, and made numerous notes in his book accompanied by quick sketches. Colonel Ashworth stood somewhat apart, his expression a mixture of hope and desperation as he watched Holmes' work. After nearly 2 hours of intensive examination, Holmes straightened and approached where the Colonel and I waited. His expression was troubled, which was in itself unusual. Holmes typically maintained a mask of professional detachment during investigations, revealing his thoughts only when he was ready to present conclusions. "Colonel Ashworth," he said carefully, "I can find no evidence whatsoever that any structure has ever occupied this location. The soil shows no disturbance beyond that caused by natural processes and perhaps occasional sheep or other animals passing through. There are no traces of metal contamination, such as one would expect from years of railway traffic. The vegetation patterns show no disruption that would result from construction. By every measure I can apply, this ground has lain undisturbed for many decades, if not centuries." The Colonel's face fell, though he clearly had expected this result. "Then I am simply mad, as everyone believes. I have imagined the entire experience, somehow convinced myself of events that never occurred." "I did not say that," Holmes interrupted sharply. "I said only that this location shows no physical evidence of what you describe. That is not the same as concluding you are mistaken or delusional. Consider, if we accept for the moment the possibility that something genuinely anomalous occurred during your experience, then the absence of conventional evidence becomes explicable, if no less puzzling." He gestured toward the moor stretching around us. "You described entering a tunnel and emerging into a valley that appeared physically different from the landscape you had left. Colder, snow-covered, with different topography. You described your return journey carrying you to a location 40 miles from where you should have emerged. These details suggest not simply that you visited a hidden location, but rather that the normal relationships of geography and distance may have been suspended or altered during your experience." Holmes began to pace, his energy returning as his mind engaged with the problem. What if we are not looking for a railway that has been removed or hidden, but rather for a railway that exists in some conditional or transitory state? What if access to this deep fell valley requires not simply travelling to a particular geographic location, but rather achieving some specific set of conditions or circumstances that momentarily render the location accessible? I found myself speaking almost without intending to. You are suggesting something supernatural, Holmes? That seems quite unlike you. I am suggesting nothing of the kind, he replied firmly. I am proposing that there may be natural phenomena we do not yet understand, perhaps related to magnetism, or atmospheric conditions, or geological formations that create unusual effects. History is replete with reports of places that seem to appear and disappear, of buildings found in one location on one day and gone the next, of travellers who lose hours or emerge miles from where they should be. These accounts are typically dismissed as fantasy or misidentification. But what if some small percentage represent genuine phenomena that operate according to principles we have not yet identified? Colonel Ashworth looked between us with an expression hovering between hope and disbelief. Are you saying, Mr. Holmes, that you believe my account? That you think this valley truly exists somewhere, somehow? I am saying that I am not yet prepared to draw any definitive conclusions, Holmes replied. I require more data. Colonel, you mentioned that Captain Hartley discovered references to the Deepfell Valley in Whitby's archives. I wish to examine those documents myself. Additionally, I want to interview the other witnesses and attempt to identify patterns or common elements in their experiences. There must be some thread of consistency that will allow us to unravel this puzzle. We returned to Whitby as afternoon shadows were lengthening across the moor, arriving back at our inn as early evening descended. After a modest dinner, Holmes departed to visit Whitby's archives, which he had learned remained accessible until late evening under the care of an accommodating librarian whom Captain Hartley had mentioned. Colonel Ashworth retired early, exhausted by the day's expedition and the emotional strain of returning to the site where he believed his strange journey had begun. I spent the evening in the inn's parlour, attempting to organise my notes and impressions of the case thus far. The more I contemplated the matter, the more deeply perplexing it became. Every instinct of rationality insisted that the witnesses must be mistaken, that their memories had been corrupted by some combination of suggestibility, environmental factors, and perhaps unconscious embellishment. Yet, their testimony was too consistent in its essential details, too specific in its descriptions, and too evidently distressing to those providing it to dismiss as simple fabrication or fantasy. Holmes returned quite late, carrying a portfolio of documents and wearing an expression of intense concentration. He settled into the chair opposite mine and immediately began spreading papers across the small table between us. "Watson, look at this," he said, without preamble, his finger indicating a particular passage in a water-stained manuscript that appeared to be several centuries old. This is a chronicle kept by the parish priest of a village that no longer exists. It was apparently abandoned sometime in the 16th century. Listen to what he wrote in the year 1537. On the 3rd day of March, the brothers who dwelt in the Deepfell Abbey sent word that strange signs had appeared, and that the very stones of that cursed place seemed to hum with unholy resonance. Father Edmund departed to investigate, but when he returned 3 days hence, he was much changed, and would speak of his experience only in the most cryptic terms, saying that the valley had shown him doors that should remain forever closed. Holmes looked up at me with barely suppressed excitement. The Deepfell Abbey, Watson, not a monastery without specific identification, but a named location referenced in historical documents, and note the mention of strange signs and doors that should remain closed. What might that suggest? Before I could formulate a response, he was shuffling through his documents to produce another. And here, from a collection of local folklore compiled in 1803, the old folk speak of a place called Deepfell, where the moor opens onto something not quite of this earth, where travellers have been known to enter and emerge days later with no memory of where they have been, or conversely, to vanish entirely and never return. The wise avoid that region, for it is said to be under a curse laid down before the Romans came, and no good has ever come to those who seek its secrets. He produced a third document, and this from a Victorian geological survey conducted in 1872. The region colloquially known as the Deepfell presents certain anomalous magnetic readings that cannot be adequately explained by known geological formations. Compass needles behave erratically, and several members of our survey team reported experiences of disorientation and time distortion when working in the area. Further investigation is recommended, though the remoteness of the location and the season's deteriorating weather forced us to abandon our studies prematurely. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes glittering with the thrill of the chase that always animated him when a case revealed unexpected depths. Do you see, Watson? We have multiple independent sources spanning centuries, all referencing this Deepfell location and associating it with disappearances, temporal anomalies, and effects upon human consciousness. This is not merely a case of recent witnesses experiencing a shared delusion. Whatever phenomenon they encountered has been occurring, albeit intermittently, for a very long time. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. But what could cause such effects, Holmes? No natural phenomenon I'm aware of would produce the symptoms described. Lost time, transported locations, vanishing structures. No natural phenomenon you or I are aware of, Holmes corrected gently. But consider, Watson, how much of the natural world remains unexplored and unexplained, despite our centuries' remarkable scientific advances. We have discovered bacteria invisible to the naked eye, electromagnetic radiation that passes unseen through solid matter, and forces that operate across vast distances without physical connection. Why should we assume we have catalogued every unusual property the natural world may possess? He rose and began to pace, as was his habit when his mind was working at its highest pitch. I propose the following hypothesis for consideration, though I acknowledge it remains highly speculative. Suppose there exists in that region some unusual confluence of geological, magnetic, or other natural forces that creates, under specific conditions, a kind of spatial discontinuity, a location where the normal relationships of distance, direction, and perhaps even time become temporarily unstable. The Deepfell Valley exists, but not in the conventional sense of occupying a fixed position on a map. Instead, it becomes accessible only when these specific conditions are met, and during such periods, travel to and from that location follows rules different from normal geography. I struggle to wrap my mind around this concept. You're suggesting a place that exists, but cannot reliably be found or reached? Precisely, Holmes confirmed. Think of it as analogous to an island that appears and disappears with the tides. Except, instead of water level changing, we have these unknown forces creating and dissolving a kind of pathway. Captain Hartley and his party happened to make their journey during a period when the pathway was accessible. They entered the valley, experienced the events they describe, but by the time they attempted to return, the conditions had shifted, and they found themselves deposited elsewhere, not through any supernatural intervention, but through the same natural forces that had allowed them access in the first place, now operating in reverse, or in some altered fashion. He returned to his seat and gathered up his documents with careful hands. Tomorrow we must speak with the other witnesses. I am particularly interested in determining whether they were experiencing any unusual sensations before or during their journey. Headaches, dizziness, temporal disorientation. Such symptoms might provide clues about the nature of the forces involved. I also want to examine Captain Hartley's original notes and maps more closely, to see if we can identify any potential trigger conditions that might predict when access to this valley becomes possible. We talked long into the night, Holmes elaborating his theories while I posed challenges and questions from my more conventional medical and scientific perspective. Eventually, exhaustion claimed us both, and we retired to our respective rooms, but sleep brought me no rest. My dreams were filled with images of valleys that shifted and changed, railways that led to impossible destinations, and that lost young woman wandering through snowstorms that had no end. The following days brought a flurry of investigative activity as Holmes pursued multiple lines of inquiry with his characteristic energy and thoroughness. We interviewed Major Blackwood and Lieutenant Granville, both of whom confirmed portions of Colonel Ashworth's account, while diverging on other details in precisely the fashion the Colonel had described. Major Blackwood was a stolid, practical man who seemed deeply troubled by his inability to reconcile his fragmented memories of that day. Lieutenant Granville, younger and more impressionable, had apparently suffered the most severely from the experience. He appeared nervous and distracted, starting at unexpected sounds and frequently losing the thread of conversation. Holmes questioned them both intensively about their physical sensations during the journey. Both men recalled experiencing headaches and a peculiar sense of dizziness as they had travelled, though they had attributed these symptoms to the motion of the train and the close atmosphere within the carriage. Both also described difficulty in remembering precise details of the journey's middle portions. They could recall boarding the train and arriving at the valley, or their memory's version of it, clearly enough, but the actual time spent in transit had a dreamlike, uncertain quality in their minds. It was as if time itself became elastic during that journey, Lieutenant Granville said, his young face troubled. I would look at my pocket watch and see that 20 minutes had passed, yet it felt subjectively as if only moments had elapsed. Or, conversely, I would experience what seemed like long periods, only to discover mere minutes had actually passed according to the watch. I attributed it to distraction or boredom at the time, but in retrospect it seems more significant. Holmes had made careful notes of all such details, and I observed his satisfaction at finding these consistencies amid the general confusion of testimony. What you describe, Lieutenant, is precisely the sort of detail that suggests an external influence upon consciousness rather than simple delusion. A shared hallucination would not necessarily include such specific temporal distortions, but a genuine exposure to unusual environmental conditions might produce exactly these effects. We attempted to locate Mr. Finch, the antiquities consultant, who had been part of Captain Hartley's expedition, but this proved frustratingly fruitless. The address Captain Hartley had provided led to a building in London that, according to its current occupants, had never housed anyone by that name. Further inquiries revealed no record of an Edward Finch matching the description, working in any professional capacity related to antiquities or historical research. It was as if the man had simply vanished from existence, along with the railway and valley he had supposedly visited. Another impossibility added to our collection, Holmes remarked when this line of investigation proved barren. Either Captain Hartley was mistaken about this man's identity, or we are dealing with something even stranger than I initially theorized. On our 4th day in Yorkshire, Holmes arranged an expedition to what the historical documents suggested might be the approximate location of the Deepfell Valley. We hired a guide familiar with the remotest regions of the moor and set out on horseback, carrying surveying equipment and camping supplies that would allow us to remain in the field for several days if necessary. The landscape through which we travelled grew increasingly desolate as we proceeded away from the established roads and tracks. The moor here seemed older somehow, more primordial, as if we were travelling backward through time with each mile we covered. Rocky outcroppings became more frequent, thrusting up through the heather like the worn teeth of some buried giant. The few trees we encountered were stunted and twisted by constant wind, their branches reaching in directions that seemed oddly wrong, as if responding to forces other than prevailing weather. Our guide, a taciturn man named Josiah Blackwell, who had lived on the moor his entire life, grew increasingly reluctant as we progressed. "There's nothing out this way," he said repeatedly. "No reason for folk to come here. The land is poor, game is scarce, and there's a feeling about the place that keeps even the sheep away." "What sort of feeling?" Holmes asked with interest. Blackwell struggled to articulate it. "Like you're being watched, maybe. Or like you're somewhere you oughtn't to be. The old folks say this area has been cursed since before memory, that bad things happened here in ancient days, and the land itself remembers. I don't know about curses, Mr. Holmes, but I know I never feel easy when my work brings me to this region." By late afternoon on our 2nd day of travel, we had reached an area that Blackwell identified as the deepest and most remote section of the accessible moorland. "Beyond here," he said, gesturing toward a range of rocky hills that rose before us, "there's nothing but impassable terrain, ravines too steep to descend, rock formations too rugged to cross, and no water sources to sustain travel. If there's a valley hidden somewhere in that direction, I've never heard tell of any man reaching it." Holmes insisted we continue, and with considerable reluctance, Blackwell led us toward a narrow defile between 2 rocky ridges. The passage was barely wide enough for our horses to traverse in single file, and the stone walls rose high on either side, creating a sense of claustrophobic confinement. The temperature dropped noticeably as we entered this passage, and I observed frost beginning to form on the rocks, despite the afternoon hour being relatively early. We had progressed perhaps a quarter-mile into this defile when Holmes suddenly called for a halt. He dismounted and approached the rock wall on our left, running his hands across its surface with an expression of intense concentration. "Watson, bring the compass and the magnetometer," he said without turning. I extracted the requested instruments from our equipment pack and brought them to where Holmes stood. The compass needle, which had been behaving normally throughout our journey, now spun lazily in confused circles, unable to settle on any consistent direction. The magnetometer, a sensitive device Holmes had borrowed from a scientific colleague in London, showed readings far beyond what natural rock formations would typically produce. "Extraordinary," Holmes murmured. "The magnetic field in this location is profoundly disturbed. I would venture to suggest we have found at least the approach to the region we seek." He turned to our guide. "Mr. Blackwell, have you been in this defile before?" The guide shook his head. "Never this far, sir. As I said, there's no reason to come here, and every instinct says to stay away. I don't mind admitting I feel powerfully uncomfortable at present." I could not fault him for this admission, as I was experiencing similar sensations. A prickling unease that seemed to emanate from the very stones surrounding us, and a growing conviction that we were trespassing in a place fundamentally inimical to human presence. The light itself seemed wrong here, possessing a greyish quality that made judging distances and proportions difficult. Holmes continued his examination of the rock face for several more minutes before stepping back with a thoughtful expression. "We will make camp here for the night," he announced. "I wish to observe this location under various conditions and take additional readings throughout the evening. There is something here, some phenomenon or property, that warrants further study." Blackwell looked as if he wished to protest, but ultimately said nothing, instead busying himself with the practical tasks of establishing our camp. We built a fire in a sheltered spot and prepared a simple meal as twilight descended with unusual rapidity. The night arrived not gradually but suddenly, as if darkness had been waiting impatiently to reclaim this region and rushed in the moment the sun's influence waned. What followed was one of the most peculiar nights I have ever experienced. The fire burned, but its light seemed unable to fully penetrate the surrounding darkness. Shadows pressed close on all sides, creating the impression that we occupied a small island of illumination in an ocean of absolute blackness. Sounds carried oddly in the confined space of the defile, sometimes seeming to come from directions inconsistent with their apparent source. Most disturbing was a low, almost subsonic humming that seemed to emanate from the rocks themselves, barely perceptible to conscious hearing, but creating a vibration that could be felt in one's chest and bones. Holmes sat up throughout much of the night, taking readings from his instruments at regular intervals and making extensive notes by the firelight. I attempted to rest, but found sleep nearly impossible, drifting in and out of an uneasy state between waking and dreaming, in which the boundaries of reality seemed disturbingly fluid. At one point, I could not have said whether it was midnight or 3 in the morning. I became aware of Holmes standing at the edge of our firelight, staring intently into the darkness beyond. I rose and joined him, following his gaze toward what appeared to be a faint luminescence visible deeper in the defile, as if distant lamplight was reflecting off the rock walls. "Do you see it, Watson?" Holmes whispered, his voice carrying a note of excitement I had rarely heard. "There is something there, some phenomenon manifesting. The magnetic readings have intensified significantly over the past hour, and the temperature continues to drop despite our fire. I believe we may be witnessing the preliminary stages of whatever process allows access to this mysterious valley." As I watched, the distant glow seemed to intensify slightly, taking on a peculiar quality that reminded me of the aurora borealis I had once observed during a posting in Scotland's far north. A shimmering, ethereal radiance that seemed to exist at the edge of perception, rather than fully manifesting in the visible spectrum. Holmes moved toward it with the same fascination a moth might show toward flame, I reached out to grasp his arm, suddenly seized by an overwhelming conviction that we were approaching something dangerous, something that should not be approached without far more preparation and understanding than we currently possessed. "Holmes, wait," I said urgently. "We don't know what we're dealing with. This could be hazardous. There might be toxic gases, or radiation, or some other danger that our instruments aren't designed to detect." He paused, and I saw sense gradually reassert itself in his expression. "You are quite right, Watson. Scientific caution must prevail over curiosity, however difficult that may be in the moment." He stepped back from the darkness, though his gaze remained fixed on that distant luminescence. "But we have confirmed something vitally important. The Deepfell Valley, or at least the pathway to it, is not merely a geographic location, but a phenomenon that manifests under specific conditions. Given time and careful study, we might learn to predict these manifestations and ultimately gain controlled access to whatever lies beyond." We remained awake until dawn, watching as the strange glow gradually faded with the approach of daylight. By the time the sun rose, the phenomenon had vanished entirely, and even the magnetic anomalies had reduced to more modest levels. The defile appeared as merely a narrow passage between rocks, with no hint of the mysteries it had displayed during the night hours. Blackwell, who had spent the night keeping watch from a nervous distance, looked considerably relieved when Holmes announced we would be returning to civilization. "Did you find what you were seeking, sir?" he asked as we broke camp. "I found confirmation that something extraordinary exists in this region," Holmes replied. "Whether it constitutes what we were seeking remains to be determined. But yes, Mr. Blackwell, the journey has been most productive from an investigative perspective." Our return to Whitby took 2 days of hard travel, arriving back at the inn exhausted, but with Holmes clearly energized by what we had observed. He immediately sequestered himself in our room with his notes and documents, working through the night to analyze his findings and develop what theories he could from the available data. I slept deeply that night, dreamlessly for the first time since arriving in Yorkshire, my exhausted body demanding rest my curious mind could not deny. When I woke the following morning, I found Holmes still awake, seated before a table covered in papers, his eyes bright but ringed with dark circles, indicating his sleepless night. "Watson," he said, as I entered the common room where he had spread his work, "I believe I understand, at least in broad outline, what we are dealing with. Come, sit, and I will explain my theory." I poured myself tea from the pot Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully left for us, and settled into a chair facing Holmes's improvised workspace. Outside, morning light was breaking over Whitby, illuminating the harbour and the abbey ruins on their distant hill. Holmes began without preamble. The Deepfell Valley exists in what we might term a conditional space, a location that occupies a physical position, but one that becomes accessible only under specific circumstances. The magnetic anomalies we detected are, I believe, both symptom and cause of this condition. There appears to be something about the geology of that region. Perhaps unusual mineral deposits. Perhaps the configuration of underground water flows. Perhaps some combination of factors we have not yet identified that creates periodic disturbances in the local magnetic field. He pulled forward one of his charts. These disturbances affect human consciousness in various ways. The temporal disorientation reported by the witnesses, the headaches, the difficulty in forming clear memories, all are consistent with exposure to strong magnetic fields. But more than this, I believe the magnetic disturbances create a kind of spatial fold or shortcut. During periods of peak intensity, travelling through certain passages such as the defile we explored may carry one not merely through space, but through what amounts to a wrinkle in space, emerging at a location geometrically distant from where one should arrive. I struggled to comprehend what he was suggesting. You're saying the train entered a tunnel in one location and emerged in another? Not precisely, Holmes clarified. I suspect Captain Hartley's railway was a local operation that served the mining area he mentioned, and the tunnel passed through a specific geological formation where these magnetic anomalies are particularly pronounced. On the day of their journey, conditions were such that travelling through the tunnel did not carry them through to its ordinary terminus, but rather through this spatial fold to emerge in the Deepfell Valley itself, a location that, while technically existing somewhere within a 100-mile radius, is ordinarily completely inaccessible due to the terrain surrounding it. He tapped another set of notes. The valley is real, Watson. It exists as a physical location, with ancient ruins, mysterious artifacts, and whatever other features Captain Hartley and the Colonel described. But access to it is conditional upon these magnetic phenomena creating the proper conditions. And once those conditions cease, the valley returns to its state of isolation. Captain Hartley's party entered during a window of accessibility, but when they attempted to return, that window had already closed. The tunnel carried them not back to their point of origin, but to wherever the spatial relationships happened to be pointing when they made their return journey, hence emerging 40 miles from where they expected. I considered this extraordinary theory, but surely this would have been observed before. If such a phenomenon existed, there would be extensive documentation of travellers vanishing or emerging in unexpected locations. Would there? Holmes countered. Consider how remote that region is, how few travellers penetrate to those depths. Consider also that the phenomenon appears to be intermittent and unpredictable. Most importantly, consider how any reports of such occurrences would be received. Dismissed as fantasy, attributed to travellers becoming lost and disoriented, or simply not believed and therefore not recorded in any reliable form. The historical documents I found suggest this has been occurring for centuries, but always in a manner that allows skeptics to dismiss the accounts as legend or superstition. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time I saw uncertainty in his expression. What I cannot explain, and what troubles me most deeply, is Miss Catherine Hartley's disappearance. If we accept that the valley is real and was genuinely visited by Captain Hartley's party, then we must also accept that she vanished from that location during the snowstorm. Where did she go? The valley is reportedly surrounded by impassable terrain. How did she simply vanish without trace? And is she still there, somewhere in that isolated location? Or did she somehow trigger another spatial transition and emerge elsewhere? A heavy silence fell between us as we contemplated this most distressing aspect of the mystery. All our theorizing, however elegant, did not bring us any closer to finding the missing young woman or understanding what had become of her. There is one other possibility we must consider, Holmes said quietly. The historical documents mention that the Deepfell Abbey was abandoned suddenly under mysterious circumstances. They reference doors that should remain closed and warnings about the valley showing things not meant to be seen. What if Miss Catherine encountered something within that valley. Something connected to those ancient artifacts Captain Hartley discovered. What if her disappearance was not merely a matter of becoming lost in a snowstorm, but rather something more directly connected to whatever mysteries that place contains? I felt a chill at his words. You're suggesting she might have been taken? By what? By whom? I am suggesting nothing definitive, Holmes replied. I am merely noting that we have an isolated location associated for centuries with strange phenomena and disappearances, containing ruins of unknown origin and artifacts bearing indecipherable symbols. We have a confluence of unusual magnetic effects that create spatial anomalies. And we have a young woman who vanished without trace from that specific location. It would be remiss not to consider whether these elements might be connected in ways that go beyond simple geographic isolation. He gathered up his papers with a weary gesture. Watson, I must be honest with you. This case has stretched my investigative methods to their limits and perhaps beyond. I can offer theories, but I cannot provide the sort of conclusive proof upon which I typically rely. The very nature of the phenomenon, if my understanding is correct, makes it nearly impossible to investigate using conventional means. We would need to somehow predict when the magnetic conditions will next allow access to the valley, arrange to be present at the precise location and time, and undertake an expedition with proper equipment and preparation. Even then, we would be taking enormous risks, as we have no guarantee of being able to return safely, and no way to know what dangers might exist within that isolated region. I heard in his voice a frustration rare for Holmes, the acknowledgement that he had encountered a mystery that might lie forever beyond the reach of rational investigation. What do you propose we do? I asked. Holmes stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the morning-lit town. We must speak with Captain Hartley and provide him with what conclusions we have reached. It will not be the definitive answer he seeks. We cannot tell him precisely where his sister is or how to retrieve her, but we can at least offer him an explanation for what occurred that does not require him to doubt his sanity or accept that he has simply imagined the entire experience. We can validate his memories while acknowledging the extraordinary nature of what he experienced. He turned back to face me. We will also recommend that he exercise extreme caution regarding any future attempts to return to that region. If my theories are correct, the Deepfell Valley is not merely remote, but genuinely dangerous. Not in the sense of bandits or physical hazards, but as a location where the normal rules of reality operate differently. Without proper scientific equipment and support, any expedition would be extraordinarily risky. We spent the remainder of that day preparing a detailed report for Captain Hartley, documenting our findings, the historical research Holmes had conducted, our observations during the expedition into the moor, and the theories Holmes had developed to explain the phenomena. It made for a most unusual document, part scientific analysis, part historical research, and part speculation regarding possibilities that stretched the boundaries of conventional understanding. That evening, we returned to Hartley Manor to deliver our findings. Captain Hartley received us in his study, a room lined with books and maps, with a fire burning low in the grate. He looked even more haggard than during our previous visit, and I suspected he had been spending his days in continued fruitless searches of the moor. Holmes presented his conclusions with his characteristic clarity, neither overselling the certainty of his theories, nor undermining the genuine insights we had achieved. Captain Hartley listened with intense focus, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification, but mostly absorbing the information with the concentration of a man desperate for any understanding that might illumine his sister's fate. When Holmes finished, Hartley sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "So, you are saying, Mr. Holmes, that I did indeed travel to this valley, that the experiences I recall are genuine, but that the location exists in some liminal state that makes it nearly impossible to reach through conventional means." "That is the essence of my theory, yes," Holmes confirmed. "I cannot prove it definitively. The very nature of the phenomenon makes conventional proof nearly impossible. But I believe it explains the observed facts better than alternative hypotheses such as shared delusion or elaborate hoax." "And my sister?" Hartley asked, his voice barely steady. "What has become of Catherine?" Holmes met his gaze directly. "I cannot answer that with certainty, Captain. The most optimistic possibility is that she became lost during the storm and found shelter somewhere within the valley, and that she remains there still, awaiting rescue. The more troubling possibility is that she encountered something within that location, something connected to its strange properties or to the artifacts you discovered, that resulted in her traveling elsewhere through means we do not understand. There are simply too many unknown variables to permit confident conclusions." Tears formed in Captain Hartley's eyes, though he fought to maintain his composure. Then she might still be alive. There might still be hope of finding her. "There is always hope until proven otherwise," Holmes said gently, displaying the compassion that he typically concealed beneath his analytical exterior. "However, I must counsel you most strongly against attempting further searches without extensive preparation and support. If you can assemble proper scientific equipment and a team of qualified individuals willing to undertake such an expedition, and if we can develop methods to predict when the valley might become accessible, then a properly organized rescue attempt might be feasible. But individual searches in current circumstances will achieve nothing except potentially adding yourself to the list of those who have vanished in that region." Captain Hartley nodded slowly, seeming to age years in the span of moments. "I understand, Mr. Holmes, and I am grateful is perhaps not the word, but I am relieved to have someone of your reputation take my account seriously rather than dismissing me as mad. The uncertainty has been the worst aspect of this entire ordeal, the not knowing whether I can trust my own memories and perceptions. You have given me at least the comfort of confirmation that I am not simply delusional." We spoke for some while longer, discussing practical matters and possibilities for future investigation. Holmes left with Captain Hartley a detailed list of scientific instruments and expertise that would be required for any serious expedition, along with recommendations for monitoring the magnetic anomalies in the region to potentially predict windows of accessibility. It was clear, however, that any such expedition would require resources and organization beyond what an individual could easily muster. As we departed Hartley Manor, and our hired trap carried us back toward Whitby through the darkening evening, I found myself reflecting on the profound strangeness of the case we had investigated. Holmes had offered theories that stretched the boundaries of conventional science, yet he had done so while maintaining his fundamental commitment to rational investigation and natural explanation. He had not invoked supernatural forces or abandoned his empirical methods. but rather had expanded his conception of what might be naturally possible. "Holmes," I said, as we travelled through the winter twilight, "do you truly believe your theory explains what occurred? Or are there elements that still elude you?" He considered the question for a long moment before responding. "I believe my theory provides a framework consistent with the observed phenomena and the historical records. Whether it is correct, whether it captures the true nature of what Captain Hartley and his companions experienced, that remains uncertain. What I can say with confidence is that something extraordinary exists in that remote region, something that has been affecting travellers and creating impossible situations for many centuries. Whether we classify it as an unusual magnetic phenomenon, a spatial anomaly, or something else entirely, may be less important than acknowledging its reality and approaching it with appropriate caution." He fell silent, gazing out at the moor sliding past in the gathering darkness. "What troubles me most is not the impossibility of the situation, but rather the very real fact that a young woman has disappeared and may be suffering or in danger in a location we cannot reliably access. That is the failure that weighs most heavily upon me, not the inability to fully explain the phenomenon, but the inability to rescue someone who may still be alive somewhere within its grasp." I saw in that moment the deep humanity that existed beneath Holmes's analytical exterior, his genuine concern for those whose cases he investigated, and his profound frustration when circumstances prevented him from achieving the outcomes he sought. We remained in Yorkshire for 3 more days, tying up loose ends and ensuring Captain Hartley had all the information and recommendations we could provide. Holmes conducted several more interviews and examinations, gathering additional data that he hoped might eventually contribute to a more complete understanding of the Deepfell phenomenon. We visited Dr. Ashford, who had returned to the area briefly, and found his testimony largely consistent with the others, though he remained deeply troubled by his inability to reconcile memory with physical evidence. "Do you think she's still alive, Holmes?" I asked without turning. "Wherever she is, assuming she is anywhere at all." Holmes joined me at the window, and for a long moment we stood side by side watching the tempest rage outside. "I think," he said slowly, "that reality is far stranger and more complex than we typically acknowledge. I think there are places where the fabric of ordinary existence wears thin, where doors might open onto locations or states of being we do not understand. Whether Miss Catherine Hartley still lives in any sense we would recognize, that I cannot say, but I refuse to declare her definitively lost when so many aspects of this mystery remain unresolved." He turned to face me directly. "What I do know is that this case has reminded me that the universe is not fully contained within the boundaries of current human understanding. There are mysteries that resist rational investigation, not because they are truly supernatural, but because they operate according to principles we have not yet discovered or even conceived. The Deepfell Valley exists, Watson. Whatever its nature, however difficult it may be to access or explain, it is real. And if it is real, then so too is the possibility that Catherine Hartley might someday be found, whether through scientific investigation or through circumstances we cannot yet predict." The following morning brought calmer weather, and we departed Whitby aboard the London train. The journey south carried us away from those wind-swept moors and ancient mysteries, returning us to the familiar world of gaslights and cobblestones, scientific certainty and documented facts. Yet, I found that something had shifted in my understanding during our time in Yorkshire. Some recognition that the edges of the known world remained permeable, that beneath the comfortable surface of Victorian rationality lurked depths we had barely begun to plumb. Holmes spent much of the return journey in thoughtful silence, occasionally making notes or reviewing his documents, but mostly gazing out the window with an expression that suggested his mind was still wandering those desolate moorlands, still seeking answers to questions that might have no satisfying resolution. I knew that this case would haunt him in ways few others had, not because he had failed in any conventional sense, but because he had encountered phenomena that defied the investigative methods that had served him so well in countless other cases. We arrived at Baker Street as evening was falling, the familiar sight of our lodgings providing welcome relief after the strange and unsettling days in Yorkshire. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual efficiency, informing us that several clients had sought our services during our absence, and that a stack of correspondence awaited Holmes's attention. Over the following weeks, we returned to more conventional cases. A matter of blackmail in Mayfair, a missing heir whose whereabouts proved surprisingly mundane, a series of thefts from wealthy households that yielded to Holmes's analytical methods. The rhythm of ordinary investigation resumed, and the mystery of the Deepfell Valley gradually receded into memory. Yet, it did not vanish entirely. Holmes maintained a correspondence with Captain Hartley, receiving regular updates on the ongoing search efforts and occasional reports of anomalous readings from monitoring equipment that had been installed near the site of our expedition. On several occasions, I observed Holmes poring over maps of Yorkshire late into the night, or consulting obscure scientific texts regarding magnetic phenomena and spatial geometry. One evening, perhaps 6 weeks after our return from Yorkshire, I entered our sitting room to find Holmes standing before the fireplace, holding a letter and wearing an expression I could not quite interpret. "News from Captain Hartley?" I inquired. Holmes nodded slowly. "He writes to inform me that he has abandoned his search. His family has essentially intervened, restricting his access to funds and threatening legal action to have him declared incompetent if he continues what they term his obsessive and delusional pursuit of fantasies. He is to take an extended rest in Switzerland, under the care of physicians who will, one assumes, attempt to convince him that his memories of the Deepfell Valley are products of mental illness rather than genuine experience. Perhaps that's for the best, I suggested gently. His continued searching was destroying him, Holmes. If he can find peace in accepting a more conventional explanation. Peace built upon denial of truth is not true peace, Holmes interrupted sharply. Then, noting my surprised reaction to his vehemence, he moderated his tone. "Forgive me, Watson. I do not mean to suggest that you lack compassion for Captain Hartley's situation. I am simply frustrated that circumstances prevent us from pursuing this matter to a more satisfactory conclusion." He moved to the window and stood staring out at Baker Street, though full darkness meant there was little to see beyond the reflection of our own lamplit room in the glass. "There is something in the Deepfell Valley, Watson. Something that has been there for centuries, if not longer. Those ruins, those artifacts, that young woman, all exist somewhere, in some form, waiting to be found and understood. Yet, our investigation has been forced to end, not because we have solved the mystery, but because it exceeds our current capacity to investigate it effectively." I joined him at the window, and we stood together in companionable silence as the fire crackled softly behind us and the city murmured beyond our walls. I thought of all the cases we had solved together, all the mysteries that had yielded to Holmes's extraordinary mind and methods. But I thought too of this case that had resisted resolution, that had opened questions rather than answering them, that had suggested realities stranger than anything our rational age typically acknowledged. Perhaps, I said slowly, this is a mystery for a future generation to solve. When science has advanced further, when we understand more about the fundamental nature of space and time and consciousness, perhaps then someone will return to that remote moorland and finally penetrate the secrets of the Deepfell Valley. Holmes nodded, still gazing out at the darkness. Perhaps so, Watson. And in the meantime, we can only hope that wherever Miss Catherine Hartley has gone, she has found some measure of safety and peace. That is a small hope, given the uncertainty, but it is the only one circumstances permit us. He turned from the window with a visible effort, returning to his chair by the fire and reaching for his pipe. Tomorrow brings new cases, new puzzles that may prove more tractable than this one has been. We must content ourselves with solving those mysteries that yield to investigation and accept with as much grace as we can muster those that do not. The firelight played across his sharp features, casting shadows that seemed to echo those we had encountered in that remote defile, in those ancient ruins, in that valley that existed somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary maps and ordinary understanding. I settled into my own chair, accepting the cup of tea Holmes poured for me, grateful for the familiar comfort of our rooms and our companionship, even as my thoughts continued to wander to that windswept moor and the mysteries it concealed. Outside, London moved through its evening rhythms, carriages rattling over cobblestones, footsteps echoing on pavements, 1,000 lives intersecting in the great metropolitan web. And somewhere, perhaps impossibly distant, or perhaps just beyond some invisible threshold, a valley existed where snow fell endlessly and ancient stones held secrets older than memory, where a young woman might still wander, waiting for rescue that might never come, or might already have found whatever strange fate that location had prepared for her. The clock on our mantelpiece ticked steadily onward, marking the passage of time in the ordinary world, while other time, perhaps, moved differently in places we could not reach. The fire burned low, and we sat in comfortable silence, two friends bound by shared mysteries, and the knowledge that some questions must remain, for now and perhaps forever, without answers that fully satisfy. The icebound train, mystery remained, like the valley itself, suspended between certainty and impossibility, between memory and doubt, between the known world and whatever lay beyond its carefully mapped boundaries. We had encountered something extraordinary, had touched the edge of mysteries that transcended our investigative capabilities, and had emerged with more questions than answers. But we had emerged, which was perhaps accomplishment enough. We had ventured to the boundaries of the explicable and returned to tell the tale, even if that tale could offer no tidy conclusion, no solution that wrapped every thread into a comprehensible whole. Some mysteries, I realized, are meant to endure, not because they cannot be solved, but because they exist to remind us that reality extends far beyond what we have so far managed to understand. And so, the Deepfell Valley remains, somewhere in the remote moorlands of Yorkshire, waiting for those rare moments when the stars align and the Earth's hidden forces create pathways that should not exist. Perhaps Catherine Hartley still walks those ancient corridors, or perhaps she has passed into some other state of being that our limited vocabulary cannot describe. Perhaps the artifacts still rest in their hiding places, their strange symbols speaking a language we have not yet learned to read. Perhaps the valley itself dreams, if places can dream, of the travellers who have stumbled into its embrace over the long centuries, and of those who may yet come. The mystery endures, as the greatest mysteries always do, inviting us to wonder and to question, and to remain humble before the vastness of all we do not know. And that, perhaps, is gift enough. The reminder that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than our daily lives typically suggest, and that just beyond the edge of the mapped world, impossibilities wait patiently to become, in their proper time, understood. Dear friend, we have travelled together through this strange tale of vanished railways and isolated valleys, of mysteries that resist resolution and questions that multiply with each answer attempted. The fire has burned low now, and the hour has grown late. Outside your window, whatever the hour may be in your part of the world, life continues its eternal rhythms. Stars wheel overhead, oceans breathe their tides, and the earth turns through its ancient dance. If you have found some comfort or interest in this tale, if it has carried you through these quiet hours toward the rest you seek, then I would be grateful if you would consider subscribing to this channel, offering a like, or simply returning when next you need a story to accompany your journey into sleep. There are so many mysteries yet to tell, so many shadows to explore, so many whispered tales that wait for voices to give them form. May your dreams be peaceful, may your rest be deep, and may you wake refreshed to face whatever mysteries your own world holds. Thank you for spending these hours with me, with Holmes and Watson, with Captain Hartley and his lost sister, with all those who have dared to venture beyond the boundaries of the known and comfortable. Good night, dear listener. Good night, wherever you may be. And remember, as you drift into sleep, that the world is vast and strange and full of wonders we have barely begun to comprehend. May that thought bring you peace rather than anxiety, wonder rather than fear, and the comforting knowledge that life is richer and more mysterious than any single story can contain. Sleep well, dream deeply, and know that tomorrow, should you wish it, more stories await. Good night.